Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, here with Sam, and today we're asking whether declassified too late is real accountability or just history getting cleaned up after the damage is already done.
Yeah, because if the records show up when nobody can still be punished, sued, or protected, then it starts to feel less like honesty and more like access delayed can equate to access denied.
That's the problem right there. So let's start with the starting take. When does delayed disclosure still count as accountability, and when is it just cleanup? Sam, start us off.
The annoying first take is pretty simple. If you wait decades to tell people what happened, that does not feel like accountability. It feels like cleaning up the paperwork after the damage has already cooled off and everybody's moved on. So the real question is not just, did they finally tell the truth? It's, does truth still count as accountability when it shows up this late?
That's the cleanest way to frame it. We should separate timing from truth, because those are not the same thing, and they don't have the same moral weight. A late release can be real disclosure, but it can also be the kind of disclosure that arrives after the consequences have already done their worst, and the institution has had years to shape the story.
So am I overstating it if I say the public hears, "We finally admitted it," while the people who got burned hear, "Cool, thanks for the update. Where was this when it mattered?" Because that split is the whole ugly part for me. The truth might be true, but the timing can make it feel almost insulting.
No, that part is fair, but I'd tighten it a little. Late disclosure can be insulting without being fake, and it can be real without being enough. We're already mixing three things people blur together: public truth, personal harm, and institutional consequence. Those can line up, but often they don't. And that's where the argument gets messy fast.
Right, and I think that's why people get suspicious so fast. If the institution gets to hold the story until the heat dies down, then release it later with a serious face, it starts to look like the system picked the least expensive moment, to be honest. Not proof of a cover-up in every case, obviously, but it's hard not to smell the self-protection in it.
That's the part worth keeping. Suspicion is not the same thing as proof, but it usually has a reason. Delay gives people room to wonder whether the institution was hiding, stalling, or just waiting. And those are different claims. We should not collapse them into one giant accusation just because the delay feels bad.
Okay, but where would you actually draw the line? If nobody can be punished, if nobody can be made whole, if the people responsible are retired or dead or just safely out of reach, then what is the honest version of accountability supposed to mean? A press release and a stern tone?
I'd split it into pieces. Accountability can mean naming the truth, acknowledging the harm, giving people records they were denied, changing the institution's behavior, or creating consequences that still exist. The trouble is that delayed transparency usually weakens some of those pieces automatically. It can still matter, but it often matters less than people want it to.
And that's the part that makes people grind their teeth. If the truth shows up after the leverage is gone, it starts feeling like the institution got to choose its own calendar for guilt. They don't get to erase what happened, but they do get to decide when the public learns it, which is not nothing. Timing is power, even when the statement is technically honest.
Yeah, and that's exactly why people don't hear delayed disclosure as neutral. Even when the facts are real, the delay can suggest the institution was managing risk more carefully than it was serving the people affected. That's not a claim that every late release is cynical. It's just the obvious incentive problem sitting right there in the room.
What I keep circling back to is that truth, harm, and consequence do not land on the same schedule. The truth can arrive, but the harm may already be permanent, and the consequence may already be gone. So people hear the announcement and immediately ask, okay, and what exactly changed for anyone?
That's the sharp question. And I think it matters that the answer is not always nothing. Sometimes delayed disclosure does create a record people were denied, or it stops the institution from hiding behind deniability forever. But if we're honest, that is a thinner kind of accountability than the kind people usually imagine when they hear the word.
So the opening suspicion is basically, late truth may still be truth, but it often arrives looking like damage control dressed up as honesty. And maybe the only honest starting point is admitting the audience is not crazy for being skeptical when the news comes after the consequences have already faded.
That's the right starting point. The skepticism makes sense. The next step is figuring out why it feels so automatic, and whether that reaction is telling us something deeper than just too late.
Okay, but before we get too abstract about institutions and memory, let's stay with the gross part. Why does delayed transparency feel so shady the second you hear about it?
Because timing is not a side detail. If an institution controls when the record comes out, it also controls when anybody can care, when anybody can check it, and whether the people involved are still around to answer for it. That changes the whole meaning of the release.
And that's the part people feel in their bones. If you wait long enough, the heat drops, the headlines move, and the people who had to live with the thing are left holding it, while everybody else is being told to treat it like history. Even when nobody can prove a neat little master plan, the effects still look strategic. The institution gets to choose the moment when scrutiny arrives, and that choice matters.
And there are ordinary reasons for delay too. Classification, legal review, bureaucracy, all the boring machinery of not releasing things immediately. But people do not experience the delay as neutral, because in practice, it can protect reputations, careers, or the institution itself, while the public has no way to react in real time.
So what's the fair version of the suspicion, Joe? Is it they hid it forever? Or is it more like they know exactly how long they can sit on it and still call the final release responsible?
The fair version is narrower. It is not every delay is evil. It is that delay changes the meaning of disclosure. Congress made that point with the JFK Records Act because it believed timely public disclosure had been blocked, and it was dealing with records that were already nearly 30 years old. That is a very blunt way of saying the weight itself was part of the problem.
By the time the thing shows up, the people who needed to answer are retired, dead, or already in some new role that has nothing to do with the mess.
And the National Archives has put the practical version of that complaint in very plain language. Access delayed can equate to access denied. That does not prove bad intent by itself. It does explain why a late release lands like damage control instead of honesty.
Right, and the annoying part is that the institution can still say, we released it eventually, like that settles the score. It doesn't. If nobody could meaningfully see it, challenge it, or force a response when it mattered, then the release is historical cleanup first and accountability second.
Is that the cleanest distinction for you? That once the consequences are over, the release can still be useful, but it stops being the same thing as answerability in the moment?
Yeah, that's the line. Late information can help historians, journalists, and even families trying to understand what happened. But helpful later is not the same as accountable when it counted. And people are right to hear the difference immediately.
That is where the suspicion becomes fair instead of just cynical. Late disclosure can still have value, but it also gives institutions a way to answer the calendar instead of the question. So the real issue is not whether the records matter once they're out. It is whether the delay let the institution manage the damage first and the truth second.
Okay, so let's take the lazy answer people reach for when this gets awkward. Better late than never. It sounds decent, it sounds almost noble, and I think that's exactly why it shows up first. Because it lets everybody feel like the problem has been handled without actually dealing with what the delay did.
It is the comforting answer. And to be fair, it's not crazy in every sense. If something true comes out later, that's usually better than it never coming out at all. That part is real, and I don't think we should pretend otherwise.
Sure, but that's where people stop thinking. They hear that phrase and act like the delay is just a sad little footnote instead of the whole point. Late truth can be better than silence, but it can still be lousy accountability.
That's the clean distinction. Truth and accountability are not the same thing. Truth can correct the record, help families, help journalists, help the public understand what happened. Accountability is about consequences, timing, and whether anyone still has to answer for it while it matters.
And the timing is the ugly part. If you say something decades later, a lot of the damage already happened in real time. People made decisions without the information. Evidence went missing. Careers, reputations, and maybe safety got shaped by the lie or the omission while it was still active.
Right, and that's why the slogan is too neat. It pretends delay is just a neutral waiting period, when often it's the difference between a live consequence and a historical note. Even if the late disclosure is honest, it doesn't restore the time that was lost. And time is usually the part people are trying to recover.
Joe, is there ever a version of better late than never that actually means something more than mood management? Or is it always just a polite way to say, well, at least somebody finally admitted it?
There is a version that means something, but it's smaller than the slogan makes it sound. If the goal is correcting the record, then yes, later is better than never. If the goal is justice or accountability, then the slogan starts overpromising the minute you say it out loud.
That's the part that bothers me. The phrase sounds like closure, and closure is a very convenient thing for people who do not have to live with the original harm. It gives the public a neat exit ramp. Oh, good. They said it eventually. And then everybody acts like the moral accounting is complete.
Exactly. And it can work like a little rhetorical cleanup crew. Not necessarily because everyone is malicious, but because humans love a sentence that lets them feel fair without having to measure the cost. Better late than never sounds generous, which is useful if you want to skip the question of what was lost while everybody was waiting for honesty.
And once you ask that question, the answer gets less flattering. What was lost? What evidence aged out? Who made decisions in the dark? Who was exposed to risk or had their reputation damaged or lost the chance to respond while the thing was still live? That's why I don't think you can just wave the delay away.
Yeah, because the delay is not just empty space. It changes the shape of what can be repaired. If nobody can still be held to account in a meaningful way, then the late honesty may still be valuable, but it's drifting toward history cleanup rather than accountability.
So the honest version is something like this. Better late than never is sometimes true, but it's only talking about the fact of disclosure. It is not automatically talking about justice, consequence, or repair. People keep trying to smuggle those extra meanings into the sentence, and that's where it stops being a good answer.
That's the better version. Late truth can matter a lot, and we shouldn't flatten that. But if we care about accountability, we have to ask what the delay protected, what the delay erased, and whether this is truth-telling or just the record finally catching up with reality. That's the next thing to test.
Okay, but before we let the records are out do all the moral heavy lifting, we should separate what disclosure is from what people wish it meant. Because my suspicion is that a lot of delayed transparency gets graded like opening a file cabinet is the same thing as answering for what happened.
The first clean distinction is simple. Release changes the public record. The JFK Records Law was built around preserving records for historical and governmental purposes and eventually disclosing them so the public could become fully informed about the history surrounding the assassination. That's a public history function. It's not the same as punishment, repair, or even an admission of responsibility.
So the receipts can be real without the ending being real. They can tell you more, but that doesn't mean anybody got justice, or that the institution did anything harder than move the paperwork from.
Not justice. And not automatically accountability either.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. People hear declassified and their brains want to round it up into some grand correction. But opening a file decades later can be informative and still be morally cheap.
The JFK case is useful because it shows the middle ground instead of the fantasy version. The National Archives says the collection was created to speed release, and by 2021, many records had been released, but some were still withheld or re-reviewed under later presidential certifications. So, it's not everything was hidden forever, and it's not job done, mission accomplished. It's partial, delayed, and managed.
And that delay changes the meaning of the whole gesture. If you're a researcher, a family member, or just somebody trying to understand the event, the information can still matter a lot. But the people who needed answers early didn't get them early, which is not a small detail. That's the part the cleanup language always steps around.
Exactly. Late transparency can still do real work. It can help researchers reconstruct events, help families fill in blanks, and clear up rumor or speculation. It can support scrutiny and make the historical record harder to erase. That's valuable. But it's mainly repairing informational harm, not the harm of having been kept in the dark when the consequences still mattered.
So we're basically splitting three things: release, acknowledgement, and accountability. Release says, here's the material. Acknowledgement says, yes, this matters and something went wrong. Accountability means there is some consequence, correction, or constraint attached to the wrongdoing. Joe, am I overdoing the distinction there?
No, that's the useful version. People mash them together because it sounds better if all three arrive in one package. But institutions can absolutely do the first part and then act like the rest should be implied. That's where the polite answer starts doing a lot of unnecessary work.
And the polite answer loves that move because it lets everyone sound mature. We believe in transparency. Great. When did you believe in it? And why did the public have to wait until the incentive to hide it was mostly gone? That question matters because timing is part of the meaning.
Right, and if the disclosure comes after the meaningful penalties have expired, then we should be honest about what happened. It may still preserve truth, and truth is not nothing. But it does not equal justice, and it doesn't necessarily even equal repentance. Sometimes it's just an institution finally living with facts it no longer has to fear.
That's the uncomfortable part. The public can get a better archive and still not get a better outcome. And I think that's why delayed transparency creates such a weird moral fog. Everybody wants credit for openness, but nobody wants to call it what it often is, which is cleanup after the fact.
Yeah, and cleanup is useful, just not the same category. The fair question is whether late release is serving public understanding, or whether it's being sold as a substitute for consequences that already vanished. Those are very different claims.
Exactly. The facts can survive the delay. Justice usually doesn't. So the next problem is whether people are praising the document release because it truly changed the record, or because it lets them say the honest-sounding thing after the real cost is already off the books. Okay, so the polite answer is always some version of, people deserve the truth, history should be complete, and sunlight helps everybody heal. It sounds clean. It sounds like somebody learned the right nonprofit sentence and put it on letterhead.
And that version is not completely false. Sometimes records really do matter later. And sometimes people are genuinely trying to make the public record less selective. But the uncomfortable part is that the timing often lines up with the moment the institution can disclose it without taking the full hit.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the nice language is doing double duty? It's telling the truth in a broad sense, but it's also covering for the fact that the institution waited until the risk was lower.
No, that's basically right. The problem isn't that the language is always fake. It's that the language gets used as if it explains the whole decision, when it only explains the part that sounds good in public. If the real answer includes embarrassment, liability, or reputation management, the polished version leaves that out on purpose.
That's the part that makes people roll their eyes. Not because truth is bad, but because the schedule looks convenient in a way that feels insulting. The discovery of conscience arrives right after the danger has mostly moved on, and everybody is supposed to act like the delay was spiritually necessary.
Suspicious, yes. Proven motive? No. Those are different things, and the distinction matters if we're trying not to turn irritation into a theory. We can say the explanation sounds nobler than the incentive structure, without pretending we know every reason the delay happened.
Fair, but what's the honest version of the story then? Because the public-facing line is always, we're being accountable, and the private math seems more like, we can finally say this now because nobody important gets burned today. That feels like the more believable translation.
That's the sharper version, yeah. I'd phrase it like this. Not every late disclosure is fake, but delayed transparency often gets sold as morality when it is also risk management. The institution may be doing something real while also choosing the lowest cost moment to do it. And those are not the same claim.
Right, and that's where the polite answer starts to wobble. If you tell me the truth matters, I'm with you. If you tell me the timing was pure principle, I start looking at the calendar and wondering who got protected by all that noble timing.
Exactly, and that's the useful split. The explanation can be partly sincere and still be incomplete. People hear, we release the records, and assume that ends the moral question. But sometimes it only answers the easy part. The harder question is whether the release actually forced anything, or whether it mostly let the institution say it had done its duty.
So the nicer story is, we owe you the truth. And the less flattering story is, we owe you the truth, but we waited until the bill got smaller. That's the gap people are reacting to. They're not crazy for noticing that the apology comes with suspiciously good timing, and that the wording often arrives after the dangerous part is over.
No, they're not crazy. Institutions love the language of accountability when the actual accountability is mostly embarrassment that got delayed long enough to be manageable. Once the embarrassment is manageable, people start calling it courage instead of cleanup. And sometimes there is real value in the disclosure, just not enough to confuse disclosure with consequences.
That's the move that irritates everybody. You get the statement, the solemn tone, the little nod to history, and then everybody's expected to feel repaired. But apology language can become a substitute for action if nobody asks what changed besides the wording. And that's where the whole thing starts to smell like a managed exit instead of actual accountability.
And that's the key point to keep honest. The words can be sincere and still be insufficient, which is annoying because it means You can't dismiss every delayed disclosure as pure theater. Some of it is real, but real does not automatically mean adequate. And the people affected are allowed to care about the difference.
So the honest question isn't, did they finally tell the truth? It's, why was this the first moment the truth became cheap enough to tell? That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the question people should ask before they let the polished version do all the work.
Exactly. If you want the clean version, you can say, standards changed, records opened up, and maybe somebody finally decided the public deserved the file. If you want the less flattering version, you ask, who was protected by the delay and who absorbed it when the disclosure finally happened? That's where the incentives start showing through the varnish.
And that question is where the whole thing gets less comforting and more useful. Because once you ask who paid for the delay, the moral shine starts to come off the press release pretty fast. Okay, but if the polite story is we had to wait because process, the useful question is who actually benefits from the wait? Because delay doesn't float in the air. It protects somebody, even if the official reason sounds neat.
Usually a few somebodies. Reputation, liability, internal stability, and career protection all point in the same direction. But they are not the same thing. Reputation is about not looking bad in public. Liability is about not building a paper trail that gets expensive. Internal stability is about keeping the machine from panicking. And career protection is about nobody wanting to be the person whose call becomes the bad example.
So what's the strongest version of that? Is it mostly legal fear, or do those other motives actually matter on their own?
They matter on their own. A manager might think, if I disclose now, I trigger a bigger fight before we've even figured out what we can prove. A lawyer thinks in exposure. A boss thinks in institutional optics. And a mid-level person thinks, I do not want this attached to my name if it goes sideways. Those aren't noble motives, but they are ordinary ones.
That is the frustrating part. It means nobody needs to be cartoonishly evil for the outcome to be ugly. They can just be responding to incentives that make honesty feel like the expensive move.
Exactly. And the big trade-off is short-term protection versus long-term credibility loss. Waiting can buy calm today, fewer questions this week, maybe even a cleaner story to release later. But every time the institution waits and then gets found out, it teaches people that the first version is incomplete by design, and that trust does not come back for free.
And the people outside the building pay twice. They lose time when the truth is withheld, and then they lose faith when the truth finally arrives looking prepackaged and suspicious.
That suspicion is not out of nowhere. In disclosure and resolution settings, generous apology and compensation offers can be read as attempts to avoid litigation. And another review found the real-world impact of full disclosure on malpractice suits was still uncertain. So from the inside, delay can look like the safer move because leadership is dealing with a legal question that is not fully settled.
Which makes the bureaucratic instinct pretty predictable. If you do not know whether being upfront will cost you money, embarrassment, or a precedent you cannot control, the easiest thing is to say the review is still ongoing and let the problem age in the dark.
And to be fair, sometimes it's not even a clean concealment decision. The National Archives has described declassification postponements when records are considered too sensitive, and limited resources or re-review can keep records out of public access longer than people think. So process itself can become part of the delay.
Still a shield, though. Even when the motive is caution instead of malice, the effect is the same. The institution gets breathing room, and the people outside get stuck waiting.
Right. And that is where the harm lands. the organization protects short-term credibility, avoids immediate embarrassment, and gives itself time to manage the fallout. But the people who were affected lose the chance to respond when the facts are fresh and the pressure still matters. The public also gets nudged into a later, narrower version of the story.
So where do you draw the line between fair caution and just hiding behind procedure? Because if sensitive becomes a magic label, it starts doing a lot of work that ought to be justified out loud.
That is the line I care about. If delay mainly protects the institution from liability, reputation damage, or internal embarrassment, then the process is doing political work whether anyone says so or not. And that is why the next question is money. Who pays when the bill finally shows up? And who got the advantage of waiting while everyone else carried the cost?
Okay, but once you follow the incentives, the next question is where the money actually shows up. Because this is where the whole thing stops being abstract. If admitting something early can trigger lawsuits, settlements, legal bills, or just a giant reputational hit, then delay starts to look less like a mystery and more like a business choice.
That's the cleaner version, yes. And to be careful about it, financial pressure does not prove anybody was plotting a cover-up. It does mean institutions often have to weigh truth-telling against very real costs, and the legal side is part of that calculation, whether they admit it out loud or not.
Right, and that's the part people want to dress up as etiquette, like we're reviewing the matter, when what they may really be doing is staring at a spreadsheet of consequences. Not always in some evil mastermind way. Sometimes it's just, if we say this now, everything gets more expensive immediately.
Exactly. There's even a basic logic behind trying to protect reported information in the first place. If people think every admission gets turned into a liability grenade, they hide problems longer. A lot of disclosure policy is built around that tension. The goal is supposed to be earlier reporting, but the fear of personal or institutional exposure pushes in the other direction.
So when an institution waits, the worst charitable version is they're trying not to blow up the budget before they know the blast radius. The less charitable version is they know the blast radius and they're buying time. And those are not the same thing, but they can look really similar from the outside.
That distinction matters. There's a difference between financial caution and deliberate concealment. And people keep smashing them together because both can feel slimy. But if you want the honest answer, a lot of institutions are making a cost calculation first. Legal exposure, settlement risk, insurance headaches, donor fallout, customer backlash, all of it. None of that is proof of bad faith. It is proof that delay has a price.
And reputational damage isn't just some fluffy PR problem. It's money. It can change who comes back, who renews, who funds, who buys, who stays quiet, who starts asking for discounts or guarantees. That's why people get so allergic to admitting fault early. Not because the truth is emotionally inconvenient, but because the truth can become expensive before lunch.
That's fair. And there's a reason institutions sometimes think about whether the public will eventually move on. If they can delay long enough, they may hope the immediate fire dies down before the costly part hits. That's not noble, but it is very normal behavior for any organization trying to manage risk instead of confessing in a vacuum.
And the weird thing is, even a cautious version of that can still feel shady to everybody else. Because once people suspect the timing is built around protecting the balance sheet, they stop hearing careful process and start hearing, we priced honesty and decided it was too expensive.
Which is why a lot of organizations hate this phase so much. They are not just managing the original problem, they're managing the price of being seen managing it. That can mean lawyers, insurers, executives, and communications people all pulling in slightly different directions. Nobody wants to be the one who makes the admission trigger the bigger loss.
So the delay itself can be a budget decision as much as a moral one.
Yeah, and that is exactly why the public gets suspicious. Not because every delay is sinister, but because the financial incentives are real, and the silence can be very useful to the institution. The hard part is staying honest about that without sliding into automatic guilt.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the money trail is one reason delayed transparency feels so insulting? Because the public hears we had to be careful. And what they translate that into is you protected the institution first and the truth later.
No, that reaction is reasonable. The insult is that the schedule looks engineered around protection, not around the people who were affected. But I'd still keep one hand on the brake. The fact that delay protects money does not automatically mean the delay was chosen for cynical reasons. Sometimes it's cowardice, sometimes it's bureaucracy, sometimes it's a lawyer saying, if you say that today, you will regret it tomorrow.
Which is maddening because from the outside, you don't get a neat little label that says which one it was. You just get the damage control version. And then years later, maybe the record opens up and everyone has to decide whether that was accountability or just cleanup after the bill came due.
And that's the real pressure point. Delay can be a managed financial decision, not just a moral failure. But once you see the cost hiding underneath it, you also see why people don't trust the timing. The next step is asking when that suspicion is grounded and when it turns into a story that's bigger than the evidence.
Okay, but before this turns into a spy movie version of history, let's stay with what the documents can actually carry.
That's the brake pedal here. Records can show delay, editing, selective release, and who had an incentive to stall. They do not, by themselves, prove a giant coordinated plot.
Which is fair and also irritating because the public hears we found the file and the people who dragged it out hear problem managed.
Sure. And that irritation matters because it tells you something went wrong. But irritation is not a verdict, and a bad smell is not a conviction.
So the ugly version isn't necessarily the cinematic version. It's more like an institution protects itself first, then calls the paperwork neutral.
That's the useful version, yes. A lot of this can come from ordinary incentives. Nobody wants the bad news on their desk. Nobody wants liability. And nobody wants to be the person who hands over the file that blows up the week.
And some of it is just the mess of institutions, right? Files are scattered, people retire. Nobody wants to be the one who admits the archive is a junk drawer.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons this gets slippery. A bureaucratic delay can be sloppy. A strategic delay can be tactical. And a lot of real life is some ugly mix of both.
Then what's the fairer version of the suspicion? Because I think people here don't overstate it as be nice to them. And that's not what I mean.
The fair version is this could be bureaucracy, strategic delay, or both. And the delay may have been designed to soften the damage. That is already a serious accusation, even before you start reaching for a bigger theory.
And that's the part people skip. They want one clean sentence that condemns the institution forever. But the honest sentence is messier.
Messier, but more useful. A delay can be a sign of self-protection, and self-protection can be habitual without being centrally scripted. That distinction matters a lot here.
So if the release happens after the consequences are already baked in, that's still meaningful, but it's not automatically proof of intent across the whole system.
Right. It can be accountability that arrived late, or cleanup that arrived late, or both. The timing can be damning without being magic. The problem is people hear pattern and then upgrade it into, therefore, every person involved was in on the same secret from day one.
No, that's the internet's favorite hobby.
Exactly. Pattern recognition is useful because it tells you where to look. It is not proof of a master plan, and it definitely isn't proof of omniscience.
So the real question is smaller. Who had the incentive to delay? Who benefited from the delay? And what did the records let the public know too late?
That's the strong version. It keeps the critique sharp without turning it into mythology. You can say, the delay was damage control, without claiming the whole thing was a single hidden machine.
And if the paper trail stops short, you say that out loud. The gap is part of the story, but it's not permission to invent the rest.
Right. Suspicion earns questions. It doesn't get to manufacture facts. And if it can't survive that discipline, it was never the serious version anyway.
Fine. Enough to distrust. Not enough to write a conspiracy novel.
That's the disciplined line. Next question is whether that disciplined suspicion still leaves two reasonable readings, or whether one of them falls apart once you separate delay from intent.
Okay, so I think the clean split here is this. Late transparency can be real truth, and it can still be lousy accountability. Those are not the same thing. If a record comes out decades later and it changes what people know about an institution, that matters. But if you were the person getting harmed, or being lied to, or being told to sit down and trust the process, then a file dump years later can feel like the world handing you a receipt after the store is already burned down.
That's the strongest version of your side, and I buy part of it. Late truth is not the same as timely repair, and nobody should pretend it is. But I also think people sometimes talk like delayed disclosure is useless because it missed the original moment, and that's too harsh. The original moment is gone, sure. The consequences are not gone forever. History gets written from the records we actually have, not the ones we wish had existed on time.
I'll give you that. If the choice is between a hidden record and a late record, late is better. At least then the lie is harder to keep polished. But I still think people overrate the moral credit of finally telling the truth after the damage is fully baked in. The institution gets to say, look, we were transparent eventually, and that can become a substitute for the thing that would have actually mattered when it counted. That's the pressure point, though. Who is asking for credit and what kind? Joe, where would you draw the line? When does late disclosure stop being accountability and just become cleanup?
If the disclosure is mainly doing reputation management, then yeah, it's cleanup. But if it changes what the public knows, what future decision makers can claim, and what the institution can keep denying, then I think it still counts for something. Not full accountability, not repair, but not nothing either. The word gets slippery because we want one term to cover too much. There's accountability to the public, accountability to future decision makers, and accountability to the people who are directly harmed. Late transparency can reach the first two better than the third. And that's exactly why people argue past each other.
That's fair, but I think the phrase you just used matters. Broader sense. Because people hear accountability and think consequences, not just documents. They think someone should pay some price, lose something, be forced to answer while it still affects the real world. If all that's left is a corrected archive and a press statement decades later, then maybe we should just call it historical correction and stop dressing it up as justice.
Maybe, but I'd separate the label from the value. It can be historical correction and still be a form of accountability, just not the full kind. The word gets slippery because we want one term to cover too much. There's accountability to the public, accountability to future decision makers, and accountability to the people who are directly harmed. Late transparency can reach the first two better than the third, and that's exactly why people argue past each other.
So your version is basically, don't confuse incomplete justice with no value at all. Mine is, don't confuse later honesty with accountability just because it's the only honest move left. And honestly, both of those can be true at once. The problem is the language around it gets so self-congratulatory. Institutions love the sound of, we're being transparent now, because it lets them act like timing is a technical detail instead of the whole moral issue.
Yeah, timing is not a technical detail. It's the difference between warning somebody before the bridge and handing them the engineering report after they're in the water. But I also don't want to turn late disclosure into a fake no-win story where nothing can ever count. Sometimes the only accountability left is that the record exists, the truth is searchable, and the institution can't keep laundering its own past through silence.
I think the fairest version of your argument is that truth has a shelf life, but it does not have an expiration date. I can live with that. I just think the people who had to live through the secrecy are allowed to say, cool, but where was this when it could have changed my life? That's not being anti-truth. That's refusing to let delayed truth borrow the emotional weight of timely justice.
And the fairest version of your argument is that the human cost doesn't vanish because the paper eventually shows up. I can live with that too. The real tension is that late disclosure can be morally necessary for the future while still being morally inadequate for the past. That's a frustrating answer, but it's probably the honest one.
So we're left with this ugly little split. For history, late truth matters. For the people who needed it sooner, it's too late. And I think that's where the suspicion comes from. Not because every delayed record is a scam, but because people can feel when an institution is offering truth as a cleanup operation instead of a reckoning. Okay, but before we put all the blame on institutions, I think we have to ask the nasty little question, are we part of why this keeps working? Because a delayed revelation gets massive attention, and the boring part where people had to care earlier usually gets ignored.
That's the cleaner version of the self-accusation, yes. Not that the audience creates the delay by itself, but that public curiosity can make delay more survivable. If nobody cared when the warning signs were visible, the scandal version of the story becomes way easier to sell later.
And the scandal version is just better content. It has a villain shape, it has a beginning and an ending, and everybody gets to act shocked like they weren't sleeping through the whole middle. That's not nothing. Attention is a form of pressure, and we keep choosing where to spend it.
Hold on. Attention is pressure, but only if it shows up when the institution can still do something meaningful with it. The public interest logic behind disclosure is basically that disclosure should increase understanding and scrutiny, and transparency guidance pushes agencies to publish useful information on reasonable timelines. If the information arrives after the moment has passed, that's not the same kind of accountability.
No, that's the part I'm trying to pin down. We act like we're starving for truth, but then we mostly reward the dramatic reveal, the "can you believe this happened" phase? The earlier, less cinematic version. The part where people had to keep reading, keep caring, keep bothering somebody doesn't get nearly the same energy.
That's fair. And to be precise, I wouldn't say the public likes being manipulated. I'd say people are busy, and outrage after the fact is cheaper than sustained pressure in real time. It's easier to react to a finished scandal than to keep paying attention while the story is still frustratingly unfinished.
That's the ugly trade. We complain about late transparency, but we also click the late transparency. We share the postmortem, we quote the receipts, we enjoy the clean moral frame once the damage is already locked in. Then everybody says, why didn't anyone do something sooner? And half the answer is because sooner is less entertaining.
So, do you think the audience is actually the driver or just part of the incentive loop? I want to be careful not to turn this into a sermon about how everyone is secretly bad because they read the story after it breaks.
I think it's the loop, not the mastermind. I'm not saying people sit around hoping accountability arrives late so they can enjoy it more. I'm saying the culture rewards the version of the story that lands with drama, closure, and somebody to blame after the fact. That's enough to matter, even if nobody meant it.
That's the distinction worth keeping. Intent matters, but incentives still steer behavior. And there is a difference between saying the public caused the delay and saying the public makes the delayed reveal more profitable than the early warning. The second one is a lot harder to dodge.
Right, and that's where the self-critique gets annoying. Because the audience doesn't just want information. It wants a usable moral package. It wants the clean before and after, the satisfying outrage, the feeling that the problem has been named once and for all. Prevention is messier than that, and it doesn't give you the same hit.
And to be fair, some people do push early, and some do care before the thing becomes a headline. But attention is finite, and the public usually notices the loss after it has already happened. That's why delayed transparency can feel so satisfying in the moment and so useless in the larger timeline.
Yeah, that's the part people don't like hearing, because it means the rest of us are not just spectators. We help make the after-the-fact version of accountability feel more valuable than the timely one, even when we swear we care about the timely one. That's not the only reason the cycle exists, but it's part of why it keeps getting away with itself.
Yeah, that doesn't absolve the institution, but it does mean the public isn't just a victim of the timeline. We help make the posthumous version of accountability feel more valuable than the timely one. And that's a hard thing to admit without pretending it fixes everything.
Okay, so the clean answer is probably the annoying one. Delayed transparency can matter a lot, but it only becomes accountability if it still has consequences attached. If the truth shows up after everyone who mattered has retired, died, or escaped the system, that's not nothing. It's just not the same thing.
That's the distinction worth keeping. The historical value is real. People learn what happened, the record gets corrected, and some of the "we never said that" nonsense dies on the table. But accountability is about pressure in real time, when a person or institution can still lose status, money, access, or the ability to keep doing it.
And that's why people get irritated when institutions act like a release of files decades later should settle the whole moral debt. It feels like being handed an apology after the relationship, the lawsuit, and the entire useful part of the conversation are already over.
Right, and I think the irritation is fair. Not because truth is fake, but because timing is part of the ethical content. An honest statement made too late can still be meaningful, just not fully substitutable for the damage control that should have happened before.
So if I'm being blunt, eventually honest is a real improvement over forever dishonest, but it's not the same moral category as accountable. Those are different verbs. One is cleaning up the story. The other is taking the hit while the hit still changes behavior.
That's the clean version. And I also don't think it's useful to turn every late disclosure into a fake total failure. Sometimes the delay itself tells you something ugly about incentives, fear, or bureaucratic self-protection. But the existence of delay is not by itself proof of a specific cover-up scheme.
Yeah, we should keep the suspicion where it belongs. The suspicion is, why did it take so long? Who benefited from the delay? And what got protected by waiting? That's fair. The leap from that to there was a hidden master plan is where people start writing fan fiction with paperwork.
Exactly. The better question is usually simpler and less dramatic. What would have been different if the truth had come out when it first mattered? If the answer is almost everything, then the late release is helpful but deeply incomplete.
So what do we actually want from institutions then? Because if we don't want a pat on the head for being honest 20 years late, we need a standard that's not just vibes. We need something listeners can actually hold on to when the next archive dump gets treated like a redemption tour.
I think the standard is tell the truth as early as you can, preserve the record, and make consequences possible while there is still something to change. If you missed that window, you can still repair some public understanding, but you don't get to pretend the clock didn't matter.
And that's the part people should stop blurring together. A late release can correct the story, and that matters. It can also help the people who were denied the truth, which is not small. But if nobody had to answer while the cost was still live, then it's partial accountability, not the full thing.
Mostly, yeah. And I think that last part is what makes the judgment honest instead of smug. You can say, good, keep the record public, without pretending that delayed honesty earns the same moral credit as timely action. The timing changes the category.
Joe, where would you draw the line on that? Like, what's the practical standard for not overselling late disclosure without acting like it means nothing?
I'd say call it valuable when it adds truth, call it corrective when it fixes the record, and call it accountability only if somebody still had to absorb consequences when the facts came out. That's not harsh for the sake of it. That's just keeping the words in the right box.
That's the useful standard. Don't let institutions trade on the cheap version of virtue. Being eventually accurate is better than being permanently fake. But the real test is whether honesty arrived in time to do any work.
And if it didn't, then the honest label is history cleanup with value, not some grand redemption story. That sounds harsh, but it's just more precise. And that's where this question lands. We're glad you listened to Say the Question. Subscribe or follow wherever you're listening, and we'll catch you tomorrow.